Yeshua and his disciples had gone to the Mount of Olives following their Passover Seder to pray. And while they were there, Judas Iscariot had gone to find the High Priest Caiaphas and others, select members of the Sanhedrin, telling them where to find Yeshua. This was the opportunity that they were looking for, to be able to take Yeshua into custody in secret, away from the crowds of followers who were constantly surrounding him. Let's look at John 18, 2-5. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all these things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" And they answered and said to him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now this detachment of troops quickly led Yeshua away to the place where the high priest and the others were waiting. This would begin the long night of questioning and torture that awaited Yeshua. The prophecies concerning the fate of the Messiah, especially that of Isaiah 53, were about to play out before the thousands of witnesses converging on Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. I'm Dan Cathcart, and this is Shadows of the Messiah. Whatever they were going to do with Yeshua, they had to do quickly. Soon the streets would be filled with the pilgrims preparing for their Passover celebrations. It wouldn't take long for word of the secret nighttime arrest of Yeshua to spread to the adoring crowds who just a few days earlier greeted him with a triumphal entry as King and Messiah. Yeshua was taken to a secret place where he was questioned by the High Priest Caiaphas. John 18, 19-23. The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus answered him, "I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always met. And in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said." And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, "Do you answer the high priest like that?" And Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me?" Now, under Roman rule, the Jews could not execute anyone for violation of their religious laws, but they were determined to be rid of Yeshua. He was clearly a threat to their carefully constructed political power structure. They had to come up with something in the Roman law that would result in the Romans executing him. It would not be an easy task given the uneasy and tricky politics of the day, along with the jurisdictional boundaries involved. They decided to take Yeshua to Pontius Pilate, the Roman appointed governor of Judea. John 18, verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they would be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. As the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate had total military and judicial jurisdiction over the province of Judea. He was also in charge of collecting Roman taxes and controlling the appointment of the high priest. His predecessors and prefects that came after Pilate appointed high priests on an almost annual basis, but Pilate, having a special relationship, appointed only one, Caiaphas, who served during his entire 10-year reign. Pontius Pilate was known to be a ruthless dictator and would not hesitate to order someone executed for any reason he saw fit. He had a close working relationship with Caiaphas and Caiaphas' father-in-law, Annas, who also ran a mafia-like organization controlling many aspects of daily life in and around Jerusalem. At this time, Pilate had only been in power for about 4 years, and had already gained the reputation of a tyrant among the people. He had robbed the temple treasury and frequently had protesters flogged and even clubbed to death in the streets. Yeshua was led to the praetorium, which is merely a place where the governor of the province would currently be residing. In this case, Pilate's most likely location he would have taken up residence in the former palace of King Herod the Great. This was located in what is today known as the Tower of David, just inside the Jaffa Gate of the Old City. The soldiers escorting Yeshua to the praetorium took him inside while Caiaphas and the others waited outside in the courtyard. Pilate was perhaps surprised at their early arrival and their unusual prisoner. When Pilate went out to meet with the high priest delegation, there was already a crowd gathering in the courtyard. It was a long-standing tradition for the release of a condemned prisoner on the Passover, and many were gathered to lobby for their choice. Look at Matthew 27:15-17. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. And at that time they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" Caiaphas knew that he could not expect Pilate to order Yeshua's execution based on Yeshua speaking blasphemy or the perceived breaking of Jewish religious law. Pilate did not care the least about their religious law. What they needed to present to Pilate were charges that concerned the Roman government, and they apparently had some in mind. Look at John 18:29-30. Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusations do you bring against this man?" And they answered and said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." Pilate immediately attempted to dismiss them. John 18:31. Then Pilate said to them, "You take him and judge him according to your law." Therefore the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." It would have been easy for them to request an exemption so that they themselves could execute Yeshua in secret. But it's likely that they didn't want the permission to do so. They didn't want the responsibility of orchestrating the death of so popular a teacher and prophet. The Jewish leaders feared the people and would likely avoid an all-out riot should Rome be the one to blame for executing Yeshua. They offered Pilate 3 specific charges against Yeshua that might raise his interest. First, they charged him with sedition and claiming to be king. Look at John 18:33-37. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" And Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." They charged him with misleading the nation and tax evasion and trying to start a revolution. And these amounted to crimes against Rome. And if any of these proved to be true, then execution was inevitable. Pilate dismissed Yeshua's cryptic and mystical answers, and Yeshua gave no reply to the specific charges against him. He remained silent, as described by the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah 53, verse 7. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Pilate returned to the courtyard, where by this time the crowd of people was quite large, and he told them that he found no fault with Yeshua at all. Look at John 18:38. He, that is Pilate, went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault with him at all." Pilate knew that they did not have a strong case against Yeshua, but he also understood their real reason for their accusations. Mark 15, verse 10. For he knew that the chief priest had handed him over because of envy. Pilate then addressed the gathered crowd, thinking that they would call for the release of this popular teacher. But whether they had come of their own volition or that the leaders had arranged for certain people to be present in the praetorium that day, when Pilate asked which of the two prisoners to release to them, he got a surprising answer. Look at John 18, 39 through 40. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews? Then they all cried again, saying, Not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. Pilate may have felt that he had been boxed into a corner by these clever accusations and Yeshua's refusal to give an understandable answer. The men from Caiaphas then gave Pilate some new information that could give him a way out. Luke 23, verse 5. But they were the more fierce, saying, He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place. Now this would have piqued Pilate's interest. If this man was indeed from the Galilee region, then he is a citizen of another Roman province and not his problem. The Galilee was under the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. This was the perfect opportunity to pass the buck. Pilate and Herod Antipas were not on the best of terms and quite often butted heads and were an irritant to each other. So Pilate sent Yeshua on to Herod, who was also present in Jerusalem for the feast. Herod was pleased with this situation. He had for over a year wanted to meet this man Yeshua, this would-be rival King of the Jews, a title officially held by his father, Herod the Great, and one which he had sought for himself, but so far having been denied by Rome. Let's look at Luke 23, verses 8 through 10. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he had hoped to see some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Yeshua would not dignify Herod Antipas with answering any of his inquiries. This angered Herod, so he had his soldiers mock and beat Yeshua. And then Yeshua was sent back to Pilate in a kind of goodwill gesture toward Pilate. Let's look at Luke 23, verse 11. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Now Pilate once again called together Yeshua's accusers and pleaded with them to have Yeshua released, since he couldn't verify any of the accusations against Yeshua. Luke 23, 13 through 16. Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and rulers and the people, he said to them, You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people, and indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning these things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod. For I sent you back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him. Pilate was determined to release Yeshua because it seemed to him that any violation of the law was strictly a religious matter best taken care of by the Jews themselves. Besides, Pilate wanted to release Yeshua and not Barabbas. Barabbas was a zealot and a thief and a known murderer. The crowd that had gathered in the courtyard of the praetorium, perhaps encouraged by the chief priest who brought Yeshua to Pilate, cried out for Barabbas to be released instead. Look at Luke 23, verses 18. And they all cried out at once, saying, Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas. Pilate ordered his soldiers to take Yeshua and scourge him. Scourging consisted of flogging with a whip, which was likely had bits of sharp stone and bone tied in its leather strands. Now, according to historical accounts, a Roman scourging often resulted in death. Isaiah the prophet again testifies to the Messiah's suffering. Isaiah 50, verse 6. I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out my beard. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting. And in Isaiah 53:5, but he was wounded for our transgressions, and he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. The soldiers made a game of flogging Yeshua, putting the royal robe that Herod had adorned him with over his severely cut and beaten back and shoulders. They prostrated themselves before him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and then slapped him across the face, placing a crown of tightly woven thorns on his head and beating it down with reeds. Outside, the crowd had grown even larger, and both supporters of the zealot Barabbas and the chief priest came together with one goal: the condemnation of Yeshua and the release of Barabbas. Once Pilate finally returned to his seat in the courtyard, he addressed the crowd. John 19, verses 4 through 5. Pilate then went out again and said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault with him." Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." It was as if Pilate was mocking the crowd by presenting Yeshua to them in this manner and with these words. This acclamation made it clear that he considered Jewish political sovereignty a laughable joke. The crowd was even more determined to see that Yeshua faced crucifixion. John 19, verses 6 through 7. Therefore, when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." Now, having heard this, Pilate again questioned Yeshua about his identity. John 19, verses 8 through 11. Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have the power to crucify you and the power to release you?" And Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Pilate feared the crowds that had gathered. He feared the zealots and their growing rebellious movement toward violence against Roman rule. He feared the power that the chief priests held over the people, and in a way, he feared this man who stood before him and gave him unexpected answers to his questions. He feared what would happen should he condemn Yeshua to death, given his popularity among the common people. When Pilate returned to the praetorium, the chants and shouting from the crowd calling for Yeshua to be crucified were even more intense. Then one of the officials sent from Caiaphas shouted out to Pilate. Let's look at John 19, verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." With that, Yeshua's fate was sealed, and Pilate's political survival was at stake. Seeing no alternative, Pilate ordered Yeshua to be taken away and the murderer Barabbas to be released. In a gesture that would absolve Pilate of responsibility, he literally washed his hands. Matthew 27, 24 through 26. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it." And all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. By washing his hands, Pilate publicly declares that he himself is innocent of the blood of Yeshua. By having Yeshua executed under Roman law, Caiaphas and the chief priest sought to absolve themselves of the blood as well. That is, they sought to rid themselves of it. Each were left with a kind of plausible deniability. But the blood of Yeshua was and is far more powerful than any of them could have imagined. Yeshua laid down his life willingly for all who would accept his sacrifice. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is the one day in the year when the High Priest enters the Holy of Holies to make atonement for all. Yeshua, our Messiah and High Priest, is today before the throne of God the Father in the heavenly tabernacle, making atonement for all who will accept and believe. I'm Dan Cathcart from Moed Ministries International. Shalom and be blessed.